Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. And you can learn more about our perspectives at FFF at fff.org. I write a daily blog. My co-host for the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling, writes a monthly article for our journal. Also, we post a weekly article that he writes for another organization. And so, Richard, welcome for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be here and with our viewers and listeners.
Once more. Maybe I should mention that you teach economics at the Citadel for those of you that are just tuning into Libertarian Angle for the first time. All right, Richard, back in the news is the fiscal problems that are facing the federal government. I mean, we've seen this type of fiscal crisis for many years. It seems to be getting bigger and bigger. We've got now in excess of $22 trillion of debt owed by the federal government. Things certainly don't seem to be getting any better. From what I understand, they're talking in terms of spending $1 trillion more this year than what they're bringing in taxes, which means that the debt will then be in excess of $23 trillion. They continue to raise the debt ceiling, which enables the public officials in Washington to add even more debt. Tell us a little bit of your analysis of this situation and what dangers do you see in this entire scenario here?
Well, the bottom line is, Jacob, is that the federal government is in many ways, but certainly fiscally, totally out of control. We are talking about a situation in terms of the most recent ended fiscal year of the federal government. The federal government's fiscal year runs from October 1 to September 30th. So the 2019 fiscal year has just ended for Uncle Sam. And the Congressional Budget Office, which issues a monthly sort of budget summary for the federal government, pointed out that the fiscal year ended for Washington, D.C. in another terrible situation, as you were suggesting. For the fiscal year that just ended, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the U.S. government ran a budget deficit of $885 billion. Now, it's not as if the government is short of money. The bottom line figure, total government expenditures for the year came out as $4,446 billion, so almost $4.5 trillion. And they took in taxes of about $3.4 trillion. Of course, the difference between what the government spent, almost $4.5 trillion, and what it took in, $4.6 trillion, gives us that deficit of $985 billion. Now, it's not again as if government is struggling with a shortage of money. Again, the Congressional Budget Office explained that compared to the 2018 fiscal year, the U.S. government took in 4% more revenues. Personal taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, 4% more in revenues than it did the year before. So what's the problem? The federal government spent 8% more compared to 2018. So in other words, the rate of government spending was twice as fast as the rate at which additional dollars are coming into the U.S. Treasury. Now, it's not a matter of saying, are these taxes good or bad? That classic liberals and libertarians think that most of these taxes shouldn't exist, and for a limited government, taxes can be a fraction of what they are now. But we're just talking about the rationales that they give. The fact is, government is not suffering for money. $4.5 trillion, and that's 4% more than you took in last year. The problem is that you're spending 8% more than you did last year. Now, this is the pattern. Now, why do they do this, Jacob? And this gets to the nub of the situation. is that the welfare state, the interventionist state, operates on a basic premise, and that is those in political power, the politicians, the bureaucrats who man the government bureaus, agencies, and departments, will continually offer things to the voting public that will garnish them votes and financial contributions looking to the next election cycle. And it's worth keeping in mind, Jacob, that the election cycle never ends. For the House of Representatives, it's every 2 years. For the Senate, it's 6 years. For the President, it's 4 years. So someone is always running for office again. Indeed, for the House of Representatives, the moment that an election has been held and those winning candidates, either incumbents or new ones, have been given their oath of office in January of the next year, they're already running for re-election. So how do you get elected? Well, in our collectivist and interventionist environment of unlimited democracy with no restraints, politicians offer always more to people than to get the votes they need. Now, the problem is, and this gets to another element that is related to this, is that economists like James Buchanan, the famous Nobel Prize winner, who wrote on the public choice theory of understanding politics by applying the logic of economics, pointed out in a great book of his called Democracy in Deficit, that through most of the 19th century and even into the 20th century, the U.S. government operated on the basis of an unwritten fiscal constitution. And it's an unwritten bumper, Jacob, because there's nothing in the Constitution that requires the federal government to balance its budget. Unlike many state constitutions, Uncle Sam can run a deficit, it can run a surplus, it can balance his budget. But what Buchanan argued is that in the 19th century, there was an attitude that government, the purpose of government was to protect rights rather than to violate rights, even though governments at all levels did certainly more than that. And that one way of keeping government honest was to follow a balanced budget rule. Any politician who was going to go before the electorate and say, tell you what I'm going to do. If you elect me, I'm going to introduce a new program. I'm going to expand an existing program, was generally taken as required to explain where the dollars were going to come from to fund that new program or an increase of an existing program, and upon whom the dollar costs of that added taxation would fall. Now that meant that politicians couldn't just say, this is the benefit I'm going to give you. Oh, there's no cost. There's no cost. They had to explain what the cost is. And again, a classical liberal would say most of these things government shouldn't do, but it made it clear to the voter electorate that if a politician promised something, someone had to pay for it, and most likely it was going to come out of your pocket. That helped limit. Government was transparent in that sense. You couldn't get things over on people fiscally, as it has become easier now. And why, Jacob? For the simple fact that particularly in the 1930s, especially under the influence of Keynesian economics and the idea that government should run budget deficits to pump up the economy, goose the economy, stimulus, there's this attitude that governments don't balance the budget annually. Governments should balance the budget over the business cycle. Governments should run deficits in bad years to goose up spending and employment. And then when the economy is not near full employment and inflation is threatening, government should run a surplus and suck money out of the economy, and it'll all balance out. But as Buchanan and others have pointed out, is that if we analyze politicians, the way we analyze people in the marketplace, what's in it for me? How can I get more of what I want? And what do I have to give people to get it? The politician is selling other people's money by offering programs that will be a burden on some in the society for others' benefit. But other people's money has limits, because eventually the other people's money ends up being your money, your income tax, your personal taxes, your corporate and business taxes. There's no way around this. So once the Keynesians said, you don't need to balance the budget each year because you want to fight recessions with deficit spending, the politicians can now rationalize, Jacob, that there's no end to government spending. There's always something more that the politician can offer to justify greater expenditures and say, we don't have to tax people. Look, things are not perfect. we'll just run more deficits, we'll borrow the money, or the Federal Reserve will end up printing part of this money, and we can have benefits today, and we put off in tomorrow any price tag of who's going to bear the burden by how much and when. And that's basically offering benefits with no costs. Now, how bad has this gotten? Again, if I can just take another couple of minutes here, Jacob, on this point. From around 1790, when the U.S. government came into operation under the Constitution, from 1790 to 1980, it took all of that time, right, almost 2 centuries, for the federal government to accumulate $1 trillion of debt. Then between 1980 and 2000, the U.S. debt went up from $1 trillion to $5 trillion. Then, under the George W. Bush administration, 2001 to the beginning of 2008, the deficit doubled from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Then, in the 8 years of Obama, 2008 to 2016, the debt doubled again from 10 to over 20 trillion. And now, in merely, 3.5 years or so of Donald Trump, we see a situation where it's gone from a little over 20 trillion to now approaching 23 trillion with budget deficits of $1 trillion a year projected by the Congressional Budget Office for as far as the eye can see. They're saying that in 10 years, right, using a 10-year horizon, that in 10 years, the total federal debt will come to somewhere between 33 and $35 trillion. Now, this is a vast amount of money. If nothing else, the interest charge on this debt every year, which is siphoned as taxes, is immense. But as long as this continues, as long as governments and politicians have the ability to say, I can give you benefits, but there's no costs, and that's separate from the moral and philosophic issue, what is the role of government? They'll pander to this. And that's the dilemma of modern unlimited democracy. Promising bread and circuses to get the votes and the support that politicians need, and the worries about what this leads to in the future is put off until an unseen horizon in which this is the future that we, and certainly our children and grandchildren, are facing. Now, again, I know I'm taking a big time in talking about this, but one more point, and that is the unfunded liabilities. That is the promises that government has made under the Social Security legislation and the Medicare legislation. Now, what these entitlement programs basically say, if you reach a certain age or if you have a certain eligibility, you cannot be denied your government guaranteed pension or this medical treatment and care. And there are these trust funds, the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund, Jacob. And they use a 75-year actuarial horizon. So basically from now until about the end of the 21st century, which certainly encompasses our lifetime and that of our children and grandchildren. And they're estimating that Social Security and Medicare have, under current legislation and eligibilities of that legislation, have made promises to the current and future generations of an estimated anywhere close to $100 trillion or more of future taxes that would have to be collected, or greater borrowing of added deficits looking to the future. This basically is the road to financial bankruptcy. We've seen these episodes. It destroyed the Roman Empire, bread and circuses, and debasing of the currency. We've seen it more recently in countries like Greece that had to get a bailout from the European Union, from the World Bank, from the IMF. Well, when we go bust, who's going to bail us out, Jacob? Oh, I forgot, Neptune, Venus, Mars, Jupiter. Yes, they'll bail us out. We're heading for a great fall. And it's all because we have failed to ask the most important and essential question anymore. What is the function and role and responsibilities of a limited constitutional government in a free society? And if we were to ask that again and seriously take the answer of what would be the role of government in such a free society, we would find that what government would do is no more than about 10% of what it does today. And the path could begin to reverse this fiscal avalanche that is threatening the country.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points. Let me take the role that you usually take in our discussions. Let's put this in a historical perspective. I mean, we start out with a country that has no welfare state, no Social Security, no Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants, foreign aid to dictators, and so forth. Virtually no regulations, economic regulations. No drug war, no immigration controls, no national security state, no Pentagon, no CIA, no NSA, no FBI, and no income tax, no IRS. So people were free to keep everything they earned. There was no mandatory charity, no foreign wars, no foreign interventions, no foreign military bases. And so the expenses of the government were very tiny. So the government would raise its money through tariffs, but it was a very small amount of money because the government didn't have the power to do very many things. And remember, no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, none of that stuff. None of these foreign wars. So the expenses are very minimal. So this goes on. I mean, this is one of the principal reasons for the tremendous outburst of creative activity and prosperity in the 19th century. Then, of course, no Federal Reserve either, no paper money, gold coins and silver coins as the money. Well, the shift starts taking place in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where the idea of socialism is percolating around. The progressives are introducing these ideas from German socialists, things like Social Security that originated in Germany among socialists, Medicare and so forth. So things start to shift, and then in 1913 you get the income tax, you get the Federal Reserve, and the whole idea was, okay, we're now moving toward this welfare state philosophy and ultimately a warfare state philosophy, but it takes a lot of money to do this. So that's where the income tax comes in. And recall that when they first were proposing the income tax, they said, oh, it's only going to be on the rich, only on the rich, no one else needs to worry. And of course, that went out the window as soon as they get World War I, and then the Great Depression, the New Deal, World War II. All of a sudden, the middle class is finding itself hugely taxed with the income tax. And the idea always is, well, okay, well, just keep raising taxes to the level to support this out of control spending. As you point out, it's never ending. I mean, there's always new freebies that politicians can come up with, new grants, new ideas for government spending, and along with the military too. The military can always come up with new projects and new military bases and new interventions. But you reach a point where people are starting to rebel against the higher taxes. And that's where the borrowing comes in. And that's essentially what George Bush did after the 9/11 attacks. He wanted to invade Afghanistan. He wanted to invade Iraq. But he knew that people would resist higher taxes. So he said, we'll just go out and borrow money. I mean, that's how the federal government's in hock so much to the Chinese communist regime, because they borrowed the money from there. And the idea is just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. But it's like a family that is, let's say, earning a combined salary of $100,000 and spending $150,000 every year. Well, how are they spending more than what they're bringing in? Well, they're Visa and MasterCard. They just keep putting it on that Visa and MasterCard. But ultimately, they reach the day of reckoning, where the credit card company says, hey, you're not even paying your interest anymore. We need our money, all of it. And that's the day of reckoning that every nation faces that borrows itself to the hill. I mean, that's what you're talking about with Greece, that you reach a point where, okay, we can't pay all the Social Security recipients, we can't cover the interest on the debt, we can't cover the military, and the day of reckoning is there, and that's where the bankruptcy comes in. And make no mistake about it, when that day comes for the U.S. government, it's going to get nasty, because the government is not going to give up easily. I mean, remember, Roosevelt nationalized gold. I mean, this was the official money of the United States. He just confiscates it and nationalizes it. Makes it a felony offense to own what had been the constitutional monetary system of the United States. In I think it was Argentina, when they were faced with this day of reckoning, they just went out and started seizing retirement accounts, like 401ks and so forth, their version of it, and replacing them with government bonds. And you're going to see that kind of viciousness if we ever reach that crisis point in the United States. And this thing cannot end nicely on this trajectory that they're on of out-of-control spending and debt. Now, from a libertarian standpoint, we would say, okay, balance the budget. In other words, stop borrowing. Don't lift the debt ceiling anymore. Make your expenditures equal your tax revenues and slash all of the difference in expenditures. But that's just the fiscal matter. There's really, as you raised, the more moral matter. What should government be doing and what should it not be doing? So we libertarians, for example, would not be satisfied with a 30% cut in the DEA. Why? Because we don't believe in drug laws. We want to get rid of the drug war entirely. We want to ditch the DEA entirely. So we think in terms of what government should be doing and not doing. We oppose mandatory charity, which includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, ditch these programs. But here's the rub, Richard. Whenever you go to like a senior and you say, well, I believe that Social Security should be abolished, not reformed, or Medicare should be abolished, not reformed, I mean, they go ballistic. I mean, man, this is their right. They put it in and they have a right to get it back, and they just block out of their minds that their money was spent a long time ago and that they're now seizing money from the young people in this country, many of whom are financially strapped, can't make ends meet, have no nest egg. Some of them are even deferring marriage because they don't have money, because the government is sucking such a large amount of money out of their paychecks to fund Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, foreign aid for dictators, and the military. So you've got this entitlement side where people are digging in and saying, I don't care what happens to this country. I want my dole. But then you've got the military taking the same position. I mean, you try to cut the military budget, man, all of a sudden, oh, national security, the communists are going to take us over, ISIS is going to take us over, or, whatever the official enemy, the terrorists, the Muslims, or the illegal immigrants, or the drug dealers, I mean, whatever they have to come up with. Look at this latest deal where Trump proposes taking the troops out of Syria, and man, again, that Congress is going ballistic, and Trump's having to look like he's going to fold. I mean, Eisenhower talked about this. He called it the military-industrial complex, but he started to call it the military-industrial congressional complex, because the military essentially controls Congress when it comes to projects like this. If a congressman bucks them, they just threaten to cancel military bases and military grants and military projects in his district. He's out of there at the next election. So things don't look good, because you've got the military that's digging in saying, we want our dole and we want you to increase our dole. You've got the Social Security and Medicare and all the other welfare state recipients that say, we want our dole. You've got the DEA and the Immigration Service saying, we want our dole because we're protecting America from the drug dealers and the illegals. This cannot end nicely, Richard, because notice what they're doing. They're adding $1 trillion of debt every single year. And that debt ceiling is an acknowledgement by Congress that too much debt is a bad thing. And yet what do? They continue raising it rather than do something about it now before that day of reckoning comes.
Yes, that's the important thing. Just in terms of the practical affairs of managing the spending of the government today, as you were saying, and I've written about it, all that the Congress would have to do is not raise the debt limit. And from that point on, once that limit had been reached, the U.S. government is on a balanced budget. They can only spend as much as it's taken in. And if they want to spend more, they can't borrow, and they have to tell the citizenry whose taxes are going to go up and by how much. And suddenly you'd find that all that they're now promising for their political purposes is far less attractive when people realize that the $5 that's dangled in front of them involves $5 being taken out of their pocket at the same time. So that was the reason why, as James and Buchanan and others, I said, emphasized that in the 19th century, this idea of an unwritten fiscal constitution, that it put a restraint on the government. They could not offer benefits without telling people the cost, just as a practical affair. If I go into a store and a fellow says, boy, if we got a deal for you, here's a new mattress for your bed, here's a new set of clothes for you to wear, and look how great it is, and it's really not going to cost very much, and he never tells me what the price tag is, and he says, just you buy it and then worry about paying for it later, without even telling me the price tag. And that is a variation of what these politicians do. They offer program increases of X, Y, and Z with with the voting electorate having no idea that they are paying for it. It's like the snake oil salesman who's up there on the back of his wagon saying, tell you what I'm going to do. Here is the magic elixir. This is going to take care of your old age. This is going to take care of your health care. This is going to assure you medical treatment. This is going to give you housing. This is going to pay for your education. And here it is. And I'm selling to you for a mere quart, 25 cents. 25 cents is right here. Now, first of all, the elixir doesn't work. But second of all, what he doesn't tell them is that they're going to get a bill later on for the full cost of all of these things, just a little bit later down the road. And that's what these politicians do. They're hucksters. They're con men. They're these guys on the back of the wagon selling their magic elixirs and making it look as if it's going to be the wonders of the world for seemingly costing nothing. And it costs plenty. And you get very little of even what they're promising. And that is why, separate from the more fundamental issues that you and I hammer away at, the only way to end this is if there were to be a balanced budget amendment. Then everyone knows the pain. The government is doing nothing except what it's taxing. And it ain't going to do more unless someone else gets screwed with more taxes. And then on that basis to say, why should we be having these programs? Look what it's specifically costing you. Let's rethink the foundations and premises upon which the government operates in a free society.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think when you're talking about the elixir and those snake oil salesmen of the Democratic presidential candidates. I mean, they're competing against each other in the offering of freebies. I mean,
Yes.
Free this and free that. One of them even says, let's give everybody $1,000 a month. And so, of course, they don't talk in terms of, well, where's the money come from? I mean, so here's the idea, I guess, Richard. You tax everybody $1,000 a month so that you can send them $1,000 a month. Of course, it's not very palatable. So what they do is they say it's only going to tax the rich. The same rationale they used when they adopted the income tax. Well, we know that that's nonsense. Ultimately, it's the middle class that's going to end up paying these taxes. But even this concept of tax the rich is based on envy and covetousness. It's appealing to that negative side, that dark side of people that resent when people have more rather than they have less. I mean, there's a reason why the commandment says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. It's destructive when people start thinking about that. Not to mention the fact that when people are free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, as long as it's done legitimately and not through government, this is a big benefit to society. You have massive amounts of capital that are being plowed into society. You've got businesses that are hiring people, giving them jobs, wage increases and the like. Now, you alluded to something else here that I think should be mentioned, and that's the role of the Federal Reserve in all this. That inevitably you get to a point where the debt is so high and the government's going to have to pay for it, which means taxing people to pay for this debt. That's why when they go out and borrow, it's really just a deferred tax, because ultimately they're going to have to come back to the citizenry and say, hey, you remember that $23 trillion we owe? Well, it's now due. We need to collect it from you. Well, can you imagine how people are going to react if all of a sudden they're being taxed to pay $23 trillion in debt? But yet that's what they're on the hook for. Well, that's where the Federal Reserve comes in, is that rather than going and taxing people to pay off this debt, they just start effectively printing the money to pay off their debt. And then that debases the value of everybody's money. It's a crooked, corrupt process. Prices start rising across society, which is the only way that debasement can manifest itself. If the value of your money is dropping, the only way that can manifest itself is it becomes more expensive to buy everything. But people don't realize what the government's doing to them. They blame it on big oil or the profit-seeking, rapacious businessman that's raising his prices, and then you've got the government playing into this by saying, well, we're going to beat inflation now. We're gonna establish wage and price controls, and we're here to protect you. In other words, portraying themselves as the savior when they're the cause of the problem. And you see the Fed doing this now. I mean, you see them artificially lowering interest rates in order to finance the government's debt, because obviously if interest rates go up, the government's expenses go up. But you create this bubble-type society, economy, where people are malinvesting because they're getting wrong signals from these low interest rates. and ultimately that bubble bursts. Now, normally when it bursts, it bursts like in the real estate market, like it did in 2008, or the savings and loan industry and so forth. But here's another possibility that may occur, and I think people should be aware of this, is that there's always the possibility that the bubble may burst in a very unexpected way. And I suspect that possibly sometime in the future could be the banking industry. That we always think of the banking industry as immune from all this. But remember that the government's been covering up this banking industry for decades, where a bank goes under and everything's real quiet. They don't just let it go bankrupt or broke like you do in a regular business environment. They go and get other banks to absorb the weak bank. They don't want to panic people. Don't worry, your deposits are safe. And they keep raising the FDIC limit to make people safe and secure with their money in the bank. Okay, so there's enough money to cover, let's say, 3 or 4 banks failing, maybe even 10 banks failing. But suppose there's an industry-wide banking crisis, where all of a sudden you've got an industry-wide banks are failing. How are they going to cover everybody's deposits, Richard? They don't have the money for that. So that means they're going to have to start taxing people to refund their money from with their FDIC, quote, insurance. So there's no telling how this thing can end. I mean, if it's not a banking collapse, it may be another real estate collapse like in 2008, savings and loan crisis. The point is that when a government is borrowing itself to the hilt like this and adding $1 trillion every year to this debt, this cannot have a happy ending.
I would just suggest a variation on the scenario that you said about a real banking crisis, and that is the government basically de facto takes over control of the banks. Maybe some of the viewers and listeners may recall that when the financial crisis began, especially in the autumn of 2008, which was still under the George W. Bush administration, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve ordered some of the leading financial CEOs of the United States, banking CEOs, to come to the Washington, D.C. for a meeting. And at that meeting, they were told that there was a financial crisis facing the United States, and they were going to receive infusions of federal money to bolster their capital position. And in exchange, the collateral for this was going to be signing over titles to the shares of the banks. And now a couple of banks, of which Wells Fargo at that time was one, also BB&T Bank, at this meeting, they said, you know, things are bad, but we personally don't think that we can handle it with our assets. We don't need an infusion of federal money in exchange for share titles. And they were told, well, that would send a bad signal. If some banks don't get a federal infusion of money and other banks do, this will imply that those banks that took it are in real bad shape. So therefore, to prevent a panic in some banks, all banks will be compelled to sign over shares of their shares to the federal government in exchange for these infusions of cash. And the CEOs were not allowed to leave the building until they had signed over those shares in government prepared documents. Now, that basically was a partial nationalization of the banking system. Now, technically and formally, the government has reversed that over the last 10 years. Virtually all of those shares have been redeemed back by the banks. But I think we cannot ignore the fact that in a real financial crisis of the type that you were alluding to, what you would see is the government de facto or de jure, that is legally or just as a practical matter, using these types of techniques to basically nationalize the banking system, and then the entire banking system would have been politicized and swallowed up by the federal government, and that's the end of a market economy.
All right, well, on that ominous, uplifting note...
That was my optimistic scenario.
Do you want to pass out the cyanide capsules to our viewers and listeners now? All right, we'll wrap it up, and enjoyed the conversation as always, Richard, and I look forward to talking to you next week.